pushing the. I don't think there is a deadline. I think there's the work's either done or not done. But I think that what we need to do that's different than previous times is I think we need to find some people and find out when they can have it done by and have a plan here versus a wish. What we've had before is a wish to a list that no one reads because it's flooded with GitHub traffic that said, would somebody please review this? And, let's move it from a wish to a plan here and it'll happen.
But Colin, that is not true. I mean, we received a lot of issues after we requested reviews. So some people do read it.
Of course, we've received issues due to implementation things that people found well building.
You can also ask on the list saying, we see people have been filing issues. Who here, like we asked in this meeting, who here has read the document in its entirety and reviewed it? You can ask that question on the list, and so then you know whether you're getting it just because of implementation or you're getting it because people are actually looking at it.
I mean, look, to the chairs, like we have experience doing this all the time in IETF, and the way you solve this problem is that in this meeting right here, we identify two to four people who commit to reading it by a given time and producing real reviews. And then when we have those real reviews, if those real reviews are positive, then we know we are good. If the reviews are negative, then we know we keep working. And since I'm asking you to do something, I prefer to volunteer to be one of those people. Especially now that I have JSF done, so I'm not as bogged down with that. So and that, as far as I know, that's the only way to actually proceed. If you actually give a shit about having the document, be good, as opposed to just dragging it through the process.
I'm hearing slight. One of the things I'm hearing from Cullen, and I think in particular, is about readability, and I think that it feels to me like that's something you could separate off from being sufficient in meeting the standard. Meeting our requirements. I think readability is something that we should be doing, but if you do it too early, then when you do add the fixes that will inevitably come, you screw up the readability. So I can't think you can do the readability stuff too early.
I'm fine with that. I only meant to imply I wish to review, did it meet our technical requirements? And to Bernard's question earlier, my experience with W3C documents is, no, they aren't adding. It's very rare to add a new API or a new feature to things during CR. But it might be very common to clarify the explanation of how something works.
Right.
I'm not asking for a editorially perfect or anything. I'm really just asking for people to have read it. That's it.
Hi, this is Janivar. Just comment on Don's comment about implementations. I think it's true we have changed our API. So on the API alone, I think there's at least 3 times we've changed it for negotiation, where I would call the real 1.0 was probably add stream, and then we moved to add track, and then we have transceivers. So I think we have multiple implementations, but they're currently implementing different APIs. So I think some of the issues filed today are based on implementation, and where we're finding. So it's not. I don't want the group to have the perception that all these implementations are not necessarily the same or at even the same point.
Right, but that's precisely the point. I mean, if we keep changing this API, there will never be convergence. And part of the CR signal is saying, well, again, we think we are at the stage where convergence is likely to happen.
Oh yeah, I definitely hope we're past changes.
Yeah, I guess having people review this for a limited time period wouldn't really harm.
I mean,
I guess my question is, if when we ask for the review, I personally think it's inevitable that we're going to get a ton of bugs filed. Do we then go back and classify which ones are, CR limiting and have to be finished, and when we finish those, we go to CR? Is that what the process is?
So I think if we want to do another round of review, we need to be asking specifically for reviews of whether or not we are meeting our technical requirements.
Right.
And of course, as people review end-to-end, they will also find bugs and other kind of issues. But those, I think, should be treated as part of the post-CR handling, unless, of course, we manage to handle them before the CR, which would be great. But I don't think we should delay sending the signal that we've met our technical requirements just because people find that things are not as clear as they need to be.
I mean, I can live with that. I think the way I would phrase this is that we do these reviews and then we classify and then we address the technical issues that are raised. And then if those technical changes are moderate and people agree they're self-contained, then we don't need a second round of like full reviews. But if we have to make very extensive changes, we'll need a second round of full reviews. And this is the way this is. It's just like any piece of engineering, you have to go over it all the way occasionally. So I guess, but yes, if this document is ready, if the people who want to put it in CR now think it is, then when people and then review, they shouldn't find very much, and fixing those things should be quick.
Hey Taylor, would you be willing to commit to doing an in review sometime in the next 3 weeks or something?
Yeah, sure.
Should we have someone from Microsoft as well?
Yeah, I'll commit to doing it.
Great.
Colin, you
got commitments from every major browser. That's awesome. That's
Colin, I think you do owe us a commitment to do it though, given the agitation from you.
Okay.
But I heard. Did I hear 4 reviewers? Colin, are you going to review as well?
Yeah, I'll review. So that's Bernard, myself, Acker, Taylor.
Yeah.
And can we agree on a
deadline? Yeah.
I would say I was. You said 3 weeks. I was going to say end of May.
Sure, end of May.
Sure, end of May.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Sorry that took so long at the beginning.
Well, this is good.
So look, I'd also like to discuss this identity at risk issue.
Yeah, I was coming to that, but
okay.
I realized that we haven't appointed a scribe. I'm taking some notes myself, but
that would be good.
Only if we care about just remembering what we decided.
Yeah, I can do some minutes myself. So we should move on then to the identity and feature at risk discussion. Eker, you and me, we exchanged a couple of emails. And
sure. Yeah. I mean, I think like I don't know what people's implementation plans are. As you know, Firefox has this feature in it, but this is in the RTC web documents, and so like given that those documents have to harmonize and like that those documents and we have like tons of those documents, I don't understand this feature can go away.
Yeah, I guess I was coming from the W3C document development process, which says that if you don't have 2 independent implementations, you will remove the feature at some stage.
But that's
or not move to that stage of the process.
CR, right? Didn't we say? Don't we get to decide what our process is? I thought the proposal was just if we don't have 2 by the time we, I guess, try to go to PR, then if we have 1, it would become optional, right? Isn't that what we said?
Yeah, that is what we said. Yeah.
So my point of view on identity is this is fundamental to the privacy of this protocol, and that the W3C should not publish it as a PR with that should not publish it with identity removed. If there was not going to be 2 implementations of identity, I think there will be 2 implementations of identity, but I don't think it should be marked at risk. I don't think it's at risk of being removed. I think the specification may be risk at not moving to PR until we have 2 implementations. And that's another thing I want to talk about is the implementations a little bit of what our bar is and why. But I don't think there's any chance of us removing this. I think it needs to stay in the spec.
Well, but
regardless if there's 0 implementations.
Proposal we made, we didn't say we'd remove things unless they had 0 implementations, right?
Well, I mean, even if there's 0 implementations of this, which there's not, I don't think it should be removed. It's critical to the privacy and security of this document, and it also is required by the IETF stuff. We would need to get consensus in IETF to also remove it. And I don't think that we meet the W3C's privacy and security goals or the IETF's privacy and security goals if we remove this.
In fact, no, I would add, not only not remove it, but also not make it optional.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so I mean, I suggested, well, I raised the question of whether it should be marked as at risk earlier because of what I understood of the implementation plan. But hearing what Colin said, I think marking it as risk is probably the wrong thing to do now that I think more about it, because given that it is indeed a requirement that we've agreed to tackle, we should not allow ourselves to move to PR without going another wide review cycle if you were to remove it, because this would be a change of requirements. So I guess I'm revisiting my perspective on this, and I'm sorry for that, but I think it would not be logical for us to mark it at risk. I mean, I think no matter what, we need to call attention to the community on the fact that right now there is no clear plan on getting a second implementation, and that was one of my goals with marking it at risk. But I think from a process perspective, it's probably the wrong thing to do.
Yeah, I agree. We should not mark it.
So the other thing I've been really concerned about is this implementation.
Other than identity, is there anything at risk? I mean, because we removed the PR answer.
I thought there was one other thing.
The TCP MUX thing?
So there are three other things. There is negotiating the MUX policy, there is rollback, and there is get algorithm method on RTC certificate.
Oh, right. Yeah, that one. Okay.
I'm actually surprised. I mean, I don't care very strongly about that, but I'm surprised people want to mark that at risk, because I mean, I'm not surprised people haven't implemented it yet, but I'm surprised people want to remove it, because I thought is that merely a formal thing? Because I thought Google wanted that and we wanted that.
Well, I think the question, a bunch of people suggested it wasn't quite right, but we weren't sure what else to do.
Right.
Maybe we just should revisit the process by which we mark these things at risk, because maybe that would be one other thing to do during this review process, because I don't think everyone was responding to the calls about what should be at risk and what isn't.
Yeah, I have to admit I wasn't paying as close attention as I should have been. I guess my sense is that if our standard was actually features which are in two or three of the three browsers, I think about 25% of the spec would be at risk. But that's different from the question of which features no one has any intention of doing, as opposed to the ones we haven't gotten around to. I mean, I don't think we even have. I mean, Yanni Bark and Breck, I'm not sure we even have transceivers.
No, but we asked for input on stuff people did not plan to implement, but I get your point.
Well, I thought we had.
The part of this 4-week review, we should have a formal request for review of the features at risk. I don't know how you do that exactly.
That sounds like a good idea.
Yep.
It does. Maybe the chairs can cook up some plan for that. I don't know what it would be either.
We'll cook up an email no one will read.
It would be good to explain at least what the procedure is for marking something at risk and how we decide, because now I'm totally confused.
Yep. Okay.
So on this implementation issue, I've gone and talked to more people in W3C about the general 2 implementation thing, and I mean, our goal is to make sure that the spec is implementable. Is one of the key reasons for this. And my worry here really is that huge portions of the spec there's actually only one implementation of. It's a shared implementation that's used widely across 3 browsers. But I think that we might want to rethink how sticky exactly we are on the one implementation or 2 implementations when the one implementation we're talking about is open source that can be used by anyone to help them implement the spec and aids. I mean, our goal here is interoperability in the end, not jumping through some series of hoops. So I mean, how are other people been looking at this? How many implementations issue we have?
Colin, can you kind of be a little bit more specific about which area you think there is only one implementation of?
LibSRTP, there's an example.
Well, I mean, that actually turns out not to be true. Not that it's in a browser, but there are other implementations of SRTP that interoperate correctly with.
There are other implementations of LibRSRT. Are there other implementations of WebRTCP as defined by this spec that use one of those other implementations of LibRSRT?
But are you talking about protocols, Colin? Protocol interop or API interop?
Well, I'm talking about an implementation of this API, which requires to implement it requires quite a bit of stuff.
Well, so I mean, I think it's an important distinction that just drawn up there, because there are, I can tell you, I know of a couple of implementations which are not based on the same protocol implementations, but that doesn't necessarily go all the way back up to the API because they're not sitting in browsers. So It's not, as far as the W3C hat, that doesn't play. But as far as the IETF protocol layer, there are several implementations.
I'm purely talking about the W3C issue here, right?
So which bit do you think hasn't been done more than once?
Well,
LibRSRTP.
But LibRTC, I don't see how that applies to W3C.
Yes, I mean,
Adam Bergqvist, are you listening? You did another implementation, right?
You mean the Open WebRTC stuff?
Yeah, in the WebKit implementation that is based on another backend.
Yeah, but that one is only used for the GTK port.
Yeah, right, but now it's another implementation.
Yeah, it uses the GStreamer SRTP.
For sake of clarity, at least if we are looking at the formal question, in WCC we will be looking at independent implementations of the API, and whether the underlying protocol stack is the same or not is not necessarily directly relevant. I mean, we could put on ourselves an additional constraint that we want to show to widely deployed browsers with completely different underlying stacks.
Yeah.
But we don't have to,
and
I don't think that we should.
Take on the protocol stuff is that, at least from the W3C perspective, I'm told that there's no intent to really try to produce the protocol coverage that would give us any assurance of interoperability. I mean, from the W3C perspective, I mean, other people might try to test various things, but I believe the W3C considers that out of scope, and so I'm not sure how we would ever get there. Like, even if you're trying to test every feature of ICE, I don't think we have that coverage today.
So, I mean, if what we're going to test in the browsers is there's an API and you don't get a seg fault when you call it, that's no problem. If what we're going to test is it does what this document says will happen when you call those things, then we're talking about. Then I don't know. I don't know where you separate from the API to the protocol stack. I'm lost. Maybe you guys can explain to me what the difference is.
Yeah, my problem is I don't even know that I could give you a test plan, Cullen, for simulcast that would truly test every part of it from a protocol perspective. Like, we don't even have a definition of what the centralized conferencing unit would do. So how do you test simulcast? I
understand. So I think what I'm pushing a little bit towards is actually our testing stack should be a little bit more relaxed, of that, there's more than one browser regardless of implementations where you can take some of this, where you can write JavaScript code that would be the type of JavaScript code you'd write from the spec, and at least the sunny day cases some won't work. I don't think we're going to get much farther than that. And I don't think how many implementations there are of that has anything to do with whether you can read the spec and figure it out.
I'm not sure where you're getting at, Cullen, but I mean, in principle, what happens is when we think we have enough, once we think we have a test suite that demonstrates enough interoperability, we make the case to the director, and in general, the director will review and approve that case. So basically, I don't think we should make too little of an effort in building that test suite. There is a lot of API surface in WebRTC that will need a lot of attention and creativity from a testing perspective. but clearly we don't need or want to test the whole protocol stack either, because then we'll never get done. So I don't think that.
I think I'm going to. I don't think that we are actually testing. We have two implementations. When we test that those use cases will test, we have two implementations. I think we should be fine with one implementation.
Yeah, I mean the charter says we have to have two implementations.
Any implementations for the whole thing.
Yeah, I'm not as concerned with having two implementations all the way to the bottom of the software stack, including the compiler and standard libraries and all that sort of stuff. At some point, you need to say enough. That you have that certainly the top layer of DOM, etc., or JS code needs there needs to be clear that two people have been able to implement those things and such that you can use them. Once you start going deeper than that, I get less and less concerned about two implementations or how deeply that lower layer of like IETF level code or whatever is tested by W3C.
Do we even have a formal definition of what done is for some of these advanced features, like the things that might require a centralized conferencing unit? Do we? I'm just not even sure, like how, if we write a letter to the director, what we have to say to be sure that simulcast meets the bar, for example.
So, I mean, I guess from a purely timing perspective, I'm not sure what we're discussing now. One thing that is timely to discuss is our CR exit criteria. One thing that is probably less timely to discuss is what exactly needs, what the coverage of our test suite needs to be, and what will be tested in what depths, because first, a lot of it will happen organically. So I'm not sure what we're discussing. Are we discussing what constitutes an implementation, or how many of these implementations we want to get, or are we discussing how we're going to do that whole testing thing?
Well, maybe as part of this review that we're talking about, we should include like whatever test plan we have.
I would not suggest this because, again, the focus of the review we expect in the next few weeks is whether we meet our technical requirements. And I mean, doing a test plan on a spec review is a lot of work for any spec, and is even more so for WebRTC. So, I mean, people should definitely spend as much time as they can on helping with the test effort, which has already started. But I wouldn't put that on the way to CR. Again, that's a different. I mean, that's part of what CR is about. It's doing and developing the test suite.
So maybe we can return to this question once we have transitioned to the CR level.
Right.
Okay, thanks. So should we now move on into the actual pull requests and issues of today? Will you take it from here, Bernard?
Yeah, I'll hand it over to Taylor since he has the first couple issues.
All right. So before this PR, the description of get parameters basically said, it returns the current parameters used for sending or receiving, and then set parameters explains how those parameters can be modified, but there wasn't a good explanation of how the parameters get there in the first place. So this started with the last virtual end-around of trying to figure out how the send encodings parameter to add transceiver affects the sender's parameter. And I've sort of now also expanded on that to more generally describe how the senders and receivers parameters are populated. at this point is just by adding some pros to the get parameters description. So we may not want to sort of formalize the algorithm more in the future. So main things that are actually being added are described in the bullets on the slide. So one of the things which comes from the last virtual interim is that the send encodings member of the transceiver init can be used to specify any read-write encoding parameter and not just the RIDs. So you can use it to give a different max frame rate limit for different encodings, for example. And it behaves as if sort of as a preemptive set parameters. And also, if you pass send encodings and add transceiver, then if you call sender.getParameters, you will get those encoding parameters that you passed in at construction time, and you'd be able to modify them in set parameters as well. And this is also describing how parameters come from the session descriptions. So for sender, the remote description will contain the codec and RTP header extension parameters, and for receiver, it's inverse. It would come from the local description. For receiver, the SSRCs are pretty much the only thing that comes from the remote description. Something Bernard mentioned is that the remote description may also remove some codecs. For example, if I offer 3 codecs, then receiver.getParameters should return all 3 of them because I'm prepared to receive any of them. But then if I set a remote description that removes one of them, it would be removed in the getParameters return value because I don't need to be prepared to receive it anymore.
I guess the other question I had, Taylor, is if a parameter has a default, even if it was not set, shouldn't getParameters return that default? Like I'm thinking of degradation preference. It has a default of balanced. So, for example, even before a remote description is set, if you call getParameters, wouldn't it return the default?
Right. Well, given how the WebIDL works, I think there would always be a value returned, right? But yeah, this isn't described in my PR yet. I didn't talk about the degradation preference or RTCP parameters yet.
Right. Yeah, so it's not quite right that it only returns encoding parameters before the remote description is set. It also would return other stuff that has a default.
Right. So there certainly are some things that are missing, but I hope that at least everything I've added is in the right direction and that we agree, can agree about this behavior.
Yeah, I think this is pretty important to get specified correctly, but I think it is going in the right direction.
All right, well, if there are no other comments, I guess we can just let the PR get more review.
I think we can go to the next.
Yeah, the points about things being populated from the local remote descriptions, I think we all assumed before. The most significant thing changed here is that if you task them to send encodings at add transceiver time, you can modify those encoding parameters even before you set a remote description. And that wasn't specified before.
Yeah, although I think there are some restrictions that we put in, like you can't change the number of simulcast layers with set parameters. So not
right. Yeah,
and
you
not
can't
everything.
change the number of them, only the read-write attributes of them.
Is it? I was just trying to scan the PR. Sorry, I hadn't read it ahead of time. Is it clear which are the read-write attributes of all of these things? Do we have that well defined in this?
Yeah, there's a table which makes it very clear.
Okay.
Yeah, but that would be a good question for you to think when you do the review, Cullen. Is it absolutely clear what things you can do with set parameters? We hope so, but that is a question.
Yeah, I will pay attention to that.
So one of the things Firefox allows is to set up set parameters, is to set up scale resolution down by and stuff like that before even calling create offer. Would that be supported?
Yeah, exactly.
Here? And
that would be supported.
Great. I do have some detailed questions. I don't know if they're for the group, but if I call set parameters and then I call create offer and then I call set parameters again and then I call create offer again, does that affect, do I get a different offer? And if so, what happens if I then set the old offer with set local or remote local description? I mean, it seems like you can get out of sync here.
Set parameters shouldn't affect anything that impacts offer generation.
Okay.
So it shouldn't matter whether you call set parameters before or after the next create offer.
Okay, good. Thanks.
All right, I guess we can move on to the next slide then. So this is just follow-up from the last virtual interim where the issue was raised that Git contributing sources returns objects that both represent SSRCs and CSRCs. And we decided to split into two methods for each. And so just for consistency with naming, I called the new method Git synchronization sources. We could have called it Git CSR or Git SSRCs, but then sort of odd that we have Git contributing sources with it spelled out and Git SSRCs with it not spelled out. So we can do some bike sharing, but that's how it is right now. So the two methods return different interfaces, which are pretty much the same with some slight differences. There's only a voice activity flag on the client to mixer header extension, so that only exists on the synchronization source interface. And the audio level is nullable on the contributing source interface because it may not be present in the header extension, whereas for the SSRCs, if it's not present, the spec requires that it's computed following the RC 6464 guidelines. So there always should be an audio level for the synchronization source. And that's pretty much it. So no significant changes that weren't already discussed in the last virtual interim.
I haven't reviewed this PR, but this slide looks fine to me. You know, modulo, I'm sure has some nitpicks about. I'm sure I can invent some nitpicks about the names or something.
Yeah, it looks like what we discussed at the last virtual interim. So.
All right. Guess we can probably go ahead and merge then. This
Something is screwy here. Oh, this is just got the wrong. Oh, I see. Never mind. I mean, this is one. This isn't one. This isn't 1113. 113 is the issue. Never mind. I will assume you can figure out which one is which. 1133. That's what it is. No problem. I was just actually I'm just studying the problem. This is yeah, okay. That sounds good to me.
All right, I think we can move on then.
So Bernard, this is back to you with 1150.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. So we've been talking about simulcast errors and what to do. And so this is a focus, and we fixed a bunch of things, but the remaining things we've been talking about have been encoding parameter errors and how to figure out what went wrong. So in the PR, we're proposing to add 3 new errors: invalid encoding parameters, too many encodings, and invalid codecs. Because we think those are 3 things that could well happen. So for the invalid encoding parameter case, that means that basically you provided an invalid RTCB RTP encoding parameter dictionary to add transceiver or set parameters. And then the question is what additional information you would need to figure out exactly what was bad. And so the proposal, which isn't in the PR yet, would be to add an invalid parameters attribute. Actually, it would be a sequence of attributes. And you would include the name of the parameters that were invalid, specifically, the attributes that weren't right in that sequence. For too many encodings, that's the case where you have you've asked for too many encodings, like in add transceiver. You asked for 5 simulcast streams. You can't do that. One thing that was discussed in the PR was, great, you asked for too many. Well, how many? What was the maximum? The problem here is, I think in the discussion we've said that this might be dynamic. So I could tell you could get back, hey, you could have sent 3, and then you try to send 3, and that also returns because it turns out at that time you could only do 2 because you were, some other browser tab or something was consuming the resource. So not clear to me that a max encoding attribute makes sense to tell you how many you could do. So I wanted to ask for feedback on that.
Bernard, I totally get the problem and think we need to write it up that it was clear that that the max, that if you use the max, it might not work. But I still think that having the max would be really useful. Rather, what's your alternative? Just guess and probe? It's a mess. So yeah, I like the idea of adding a max with the limitations you said. Okay. So we'll go in that direction. And then the last one is invalid codecs, where you did something weird, like you added a codec that wasn't in the list or something, or something got taken out, and so you put in invalid or unavailable codecs and set parameters or set codec preferences. And so for this case, again, proposal is to return a sequence in the invalid codecs attribute that would include the MIME types of the codecs that were invalid. To kind of give you a hint about what you did.
So I think we should try to separate parameters that are invalid according to the specification versus parameters that aren't supported by the browser. So, for example, if I try to add a codec that wasn't there in the first place, that should result in an invalid modification error already. Whereas if I try to, remove all codecs but the one I want, and that, it was a hardware encoder and it's no longer available, that's when this error was going to be necessary. It's valid, but the browser doesn't currently support it anymore.
Yeah, okay. Just a question, maybe for my clarification, because a bunch of the things, right, we're already throwing exceptions or rejecting promises for various things like invalid modification. Would you, my question, I guess, is would you also in some of those cases also have an RTC error, or are those kind of mutually exclusive?
Well, I thought we were using RTC error for the situations that required an additional field, basically, where just the DOM exception wasn't enough.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's what we were doing as well. It's just, it may not be entirely clear in the spec currently. Okay. So we'll take this feedback and try to finish the PR. And of course, we'd welcome more review. Next one. Okay. So this one is about DTLS failures, and specifically the goal is to try to provide information on recoverable DTLS errors and to distinguish them from unrecoverable errors. So 3 things were specifically mentioned in the issue by various folks. One was cryptographic negotiation failure, and this would be a case where, say, a browser offers ECDSA certificates by default, and for some reason they encounter, although every browser supports that, they encounter some legacy mobile app or something that only does RSA or only does DTLS 1.0 or something. And as a result, the cryptographic negotiation fails, and you could recover, I guess, by using the Certificate Management API to offer an RSA cert. And then you might want to distinguish that from something like the fingerprint not being verified or some protocol version failure if for some reason you decided, browser decided they didn't want to allow DTLS 1.0 because browsers now do at least 1.2, but again, they encounter some weird legacy mobile thing. So we've had a little bit of discussion about where these are covered in the DTLS alerts. So now that we have Ecker, we can maybe see if we understand this correctly. The cryptographic negotiation failure, I think, is number 43, unsupported certificate. Is that right, Ecker?
Let me just take a look now, actually, myself. I guess one thing to say is that, I guess I'll say 2 things. One is that DTLS implementations are not incredibly good at sending sending the alert you would have hoped. Is the first thing I would say. That there's it's pretty common to send handshake failure or just tear the connection and this kind of stuff. And remember that in DTLS, the alerts are also unreliable, and so you don't right. And so I say there's no guarantee you'll be delivered at all. And thirdly, the guy who sends the alert is maybe not the guy who understands what's going on. So I mean, so to give take the concrete example you just indicated, right? So the client in the client offers only offers only RSA signature algorithms, and the server only has ECDSA. So in the best case scenario, what will happen will be the server will send unsupported certificate. That's at least what you have to do in 1.3. I'm looking at 1.3 now. And I went with the 1.3, the 1.2, they said that things were less clear about what exactly alerts to send. I think this one was still clear. And then locally, you would return an error that would be like, I couldn't find a certificate. And you're actually the one whose job it will be to fix that, right? In this particular case. Now, I mean, it's, of course, you is a complicated question in the sense that it's the same web app, right? But I mean, it's the browser that sends the alert that actually has much more information on what the problem is. So I think if our intention is to actually attempt to live field diagnose, I think more interesting perhaps than surfacing the alert is surfacing some effectively free-form JavaScript thing to tell you like this is what went wrong that you could then diagnose. Now, whether attempting to standardize those is useful, I'm not sure. But I mean, so specifically, I'll tell you what NSS does. NSS, when the handshake fails, NSS returns like one of about 200 error codes, and about 30 of those error codes are I received alert X. And the other 170 or so, I'm exaggerating a little bit, not that much, are something went wrong, and here's like the exact thing that went wrong, right? And so rather than attempting to standardize this, I think I'd be tempted, given that you're almost going to have to modify your software to fix it, I think I'd be tempted to just say, like, here is a free-form error which the implementation can shove in and you can interpret yourself. I think that would be more useful, probably. And boring SSL using entirely different error codes, and any attempt, and so trying to hit those error codes. I mean, the particular ones that TLS actually uses in the wire were intended to tell the other side something about it, but they were intended for really an environment that was very different than the one we are in now, which is to say, one where you didn't really have control of the endpoint.
I mean, I get what you're saying. That sort of makes sense, but I'd still like to see any broad class of error code that was repairable, like you need to use a cert with a different algorithm, or even ones that were just loggable in a consistent way by, a cloud system to understand what was going on from a sort of analytics and metrics point of view. I'd rather see those be reported in a common form between the various browsers.
I mean, then in that case, I think there are only two real options. One is to say, is to have maybe there's a uniform, maybe you do both of these. One is to say, I sent this alert or I received this alert, right? You want to do both, obviously. And you almost never will have both. That is to say, it's almost always the case. You start when you receive one. There are a few edge cases where you send and receive both. But in particular, if something goes really, really badly wrong, you might have like MAC errors or crossing MAC errors, for instance. But and then if you want something standardized, we'll have to invent things beyond that, because there's nothing standardized beyond that.
Okay. Sorry, I just missed the last thing you said.
What I said was beyond saying I sent this alert or I received this alert. Yeah. If you want any more detailed errors, you would have to name them. You have to start inventing them.
Okay, I see.
So I just want to make sure this gets put down in the minutes. And correct me, Ecker. So there should be something to whether you sent it or received it. That's additional information that's not there currently. And in addition, I don't think we talk in this PR about any of the contents of the message, which I guess might be above and beyond the DTLS the TLS alert attribute.
The contents of the message being like what message caused you to be sad, or a more detailed error, if it was implementation specific error.
Yeah, I was thinking more implementation specific information. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say I've had a little bit of experience with this in the last couple of weeks. I tripped over a Chrome bug where you set one of the extensions that's mandatory for WebRTC but not mandatory in general in DTLS wasn't being set, and did that under certain circumstances. So that's something that would be nice to field up, but it won't be an alert. But it would be really good. Those kinds of things would be good to come kind of bubble up. Hey, I'm not talking to this guy in this specific case. we couldn't you couldn't extract the key material because the use SRTP wasn't set.
So I guess, were you not set, just out of curiosity, were you not setting it or were they not setting it?
So the deal was that Chrome didn't set use SRTP when you created a data channel only.
Yeah, I believe that. Yeah, that's I can see how that happened. That would be unfortunate. I think so. I guess I would suggest we do both. I suggest that we modify the alerts to be both I sent and I received, and then we have a slot for. The implementation would like tell you something about what the hell happened, and I would just make it a string, and the implementation do whatever it wants with that. And that at the worst case you don't have that. In the best case, you know maybe it helps you. I'll tell you, we constantly look at those error codes. We don't use alerts very much when we diagnose errors ourselves.
So isn't
I mean, I don't know. I think we have the other places, right?
Could you repeat, Taylor?
Sorry. Can't the implementation already use the RTC error message for whatever message it wants?
That's true.
I mean, these all seem like non-recoverable errors that we just want to blast out some log string, for debugging, and they're not going to be machine consumable.
Yeah, that's really what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting basically what we return would be NSS error, and then we just print out we stringify the name of the error code basically. That's what we have people do this with for God's sake, that's what Firefox actually does with a user. If you go to some website and you have a real TLS error.
Okay.
I'm indifferent to where that goes. I'm just saying that if we actually are serious about helping people debug these things, I think that would be useful. But if I'd be perfectly happy to, if Taylor suggests, I'd be perfectly happy to have a some generic thing that was or just suggests here is essentially a set of freeform complaining about what happened. We find so.
All of this sounds good and going in the right direction. We've had a hard time debugging this, particularly in environments where there was man in the middle proxies that we're intercepting and rewriting.
So I don't mean to be arguing. I'm perfectly happy to have the alert thing. I think the only change would be we should have it be they should have a boolean that was I sent this alert or I received this alert.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Next issue. Okay, I don't think Fulip is on the call, so I'll try to explain this as best as I can. We've been using frozen array as a static read-only attribute, and I think Fulip objected to that, and I think he's been saying it's illegal in WebIDL. And as a result is proposing to replace these instances of frozen array with a get method.
Yeah, this is Janivar. I think it's to clarify, it's not so much that it's illegal, but that the freezing that frozen array does is shallow. It's not recursive, so it's only the array itself that would be frozen, and the objects that you'd be returning would actually be modifiable, which limits their usefulness. And I believe in these two cases, it made more sense to return sequence, which is defined as a copy every time you get it. And that would be saner as far as what can happen if you really, you could do a lot of wrong things with the objects you returned otherwise that could cause action at a distance. I think there's, the PR here doesn't show it, but there's one remaining place where we did use same object, which was in the event, where it still made sense because an event is such a short-lived object that if you trash this object, it's not going to have remote effects on code elsewhere. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So the belief is that in neither of these cases has this been implemented, so changing it to wouldn't create any backward compatibility issue. So is there any
Anvar, do
objection?
you think we should make this change? Is this?
Yeah, Firefox does not implement these, so I think we're good. At least default by service on double checking fingerprints.
Okay, sounds like we should go with the change.
Yeah. Okay, next one. Next slide, Taylor.
All right, so there's been some discussion about whether track IDs still work or not. And the issue is that when transceivers were introduced and we wanted to address the early media use case, we have the RTP receiver is created as soon as the transceiver is created, and its track is created at the same time, such that if you call add transceiver, you can immediately hook up the receiver's track to a media stream and video tag before you've done any offer answer yet. And that track's ID can't change after it's created based on just how media stream track is defined. So the result is that we need to use a generated ID for the receiver's track, and when the on-track event, when the track event eventually fires due to, say, a remote description, the ID of the track won't match what was actually in the remote description. And this only affects track IDs, not stream IDs, because the stream is only created from, saying, a remote description. But basically, if you want to, convey some information about which track is which, you can't really use the track IDs reliably anymore. You'd have to use something else like MIDs or M section indices. So next slide. I think we've sort of talked about this informally at TPAC and at other times, but it's continued to cause confusion. So I think we should, if we decide to leave it as it is, we should probably document it better so people aren't surprised when track IDs don't match. Or we could also consider doing something more severe, like getting rid of track ID signaling altogether. So I don't know if it would be too late for this. Or try to work around the problem in some way. For example, I don't know if this would work, but random idea, we could only generate the ID and create the track when you try to access it, or we could introduce more special case behavior for add track. There are probably things we could do if we thought this was important.
Didn't we discuss this way back and said the track would have a null ID until you had set a description or something like that? Or
I don't think the track having a null ID is an option.
Or an empty string.
Just because we don't have the media stream track interface.
Right, that's in media capture, and those are immutable.
My main concern with the track ID stuff is assumptions that the sender and the receiver share the same track ID, which is not necessarily always the case. And quite honestly, I don't see why that should ever be the case, because it also confuses things when you have things like replace track. I think any assumptions the two of them are linked should be broken.
Wasn't that effectively what Taylor's B is, second point?
Get rid of tracks ID signaling altogether.
Yeah.
I mean, frankly, I feel like, for the reasons like what Reynold just mentioned, there are many cases where the ID signaling just doesn't really work. Once you get into depth, if you do replace track, now it's really a coupling between the sender and receiver rather than the input track to the output track. And then the sender and receiver identified by their MID rather than like the track. And I know Harold has been the main person I think who's been pushing on we need to have, some way of signaling tracks. And, since he's not here, we can't hear that point of view. But it all seems like, a bit of like a thing has some brokenness in it to begin with.
I think Harold's position on this was largely that this has become completely redundant with the other stuff we had and was no longer really needed.
Yeah, I was going to make the same comment.
He always made the argument that there was still some reason to keep it around.
Right. And he felt very strongly about it, but, it always seemed like, okay, there's something, but like, there wasn't, I can't think of a good example offhand of a case that breaks if you don't have it.
Well, there's nothing that you couldn't use MIDs for instead, but existing applications might be relying on track IDs, and that will break once Chrome and Firefox implement transceivers according to the standard.
Yes, that would break. I don't know if people are doing that, but yeah.
So, Taylor, where's the case where this really kicks in? This is where you create your receiver. The receiver is created on the caller side, like immediately upon, add transceiver. And so if you go and like inspect that track, you don't know what the right track ID should be there until you get the right description.
Yeah.
Well, I think this would kick in almost all the time. I mean, to be clear, this would also happen, not just when you call add transceiver, but also add track. I mean, you call add track now, everything, including remote tracks, are created right away. So this is fundamentally different model.
Anytime you don't start with set remote description, basically.
Yes. So the one case that still works is if you call set remote description on the answer side and then add your tracks.
So just looking at reducing the amount of work for editors and getting to CR here, I think I sort of lean towards let's get rid of track ID altogether, because the existing stuff that's going to break is going to break anyway. And this seems like a really complicated and confusing thing to explain to implementers such that they don't shoot themselves in the foot.
Right.
Track IDs are mostly stable except when they're not.
But that basically means that we would get rid of MSID and the entire document and like any other sort of places where that interacts with other things we'll have to update it too.
Well,
okay,
I'm not sure
less keen on that.
Just get rid of the track ID part. MSID is media stream ID, and media stream stuff still works. So you could just have A equals MSID with a stream ID for each M section, and that way you can match tracks to streams if you're not doing the early media thing, such that the right stream is fired in the track event.
So right now it's like media stream ID : track ID. Is that the right?
Something like that, yeah. Or I think it's space denoted.
All right. So we just knock off the second part.
Does that work?
I mean, we could take that as a straw man and go see if that works. But basically, what you'd be saying here would be that, A just sends an offer to B, A has track ID of X, B just generates its own track ID Y, and that's just life.
Yeah.
Well, in some way, I mean, removing it doesn't really do anything other than perhaps clarify. But that's sort of a low-level thing, and people using the API might still have expectations. So I think we should either remove the ID part or document it more clearly in the API, or both.
It's kind of weird that the stream ID goes across, but the track ID doesn't go across, I have to say.
Well,
exactly, it's confusing.
The issue is that the receiver's track is fundamentally different than the sender's track, because you can call replace track on the sender side and the receiver's track doesn't change.
Yeah, I guess the track ID is more from a legacy point of view before we have had the transceivers. That's a way to synchronize.
Yeah. Yes, but to some sort of novice WebRTC programmer, I don't think it would be obvious that, the stream IDs are, carried across, but the track IDs aren't. I mean,
it's still not intuitive.
Right.
But still, though, I would hope we don't get rid of stream IDs signaling, because that leaves people in a rough spot right now with no way to transition from the old way of doing things, correlating tracks, to the new way. Just to speak to the third bullet, that would be sort of a hack. I would call that the observer's paradox anti-pattern, since if you actually, you could actually, as long as JavaScript does not ask for the attribute, it's still secret, and you could modify it behind the scenes. But that leads to action at a distance, in that some benign-looking code might think it's totally innocent to get the attribute early, and then it would actually cause the ID to never update. So I don't think we want to do that.
But Jan-Ivar, I was thinking, you said that this will happen pretty often. Aren't the media stream ID and the track ID signal in the STP, so it's actually only for the early media cases? This is a problem.
No, because the transceiver model is totally different in that even if you call add track now, you immediately after calling add track synchronously, you can then interrogate a receiver on your same peer connection. So that means the track that you will eventually
that's true.
Will have to be created at that point, and that needs an ID. And it can't both be early and correlated with the remote side.
Yeah, you get the whole shebang at the same time, that's right.
I think you could say that the track has no ID until remote description is called. That the receiver there has
a MID, so we do have the mids are null until you get them from the other side, or if it's set with set local or set remote. So we already have that kind of.
Yeah, but we're already overloading media capture, stream ID, and track ID, which are inherently needed to keep track internally for people just adding and removing tracks to a stream. So there's no way to have a track with an ID that's null unless we change media capture.
Yeah.
So I would say I don't think it's worth trying to save track ID, given that it can change in so many cases naturally with replace track already. It would be a shame if we lost stream ID, I think.
Yeah, and we would have to say that the stream ID is carried over, but the track ID is only remote, only locally applicable. Has nothing to do with the same track on the other end.
Because the remote stream is secret until you get the track event, provided we can get rid of the get remote streams method in existing implementations.
This has always bothered me. So I think that if we want to go ahead and see what happens if we try to remove track ID and see if that works, I think that seems like a good idea.
When you say remove track ID, you don't mean that. The track would still have an ID. It's only that it's not corresponding to the remote track's ID.
Right.
Yeah.
But given that, I don't know why anyone would ever call it anymore.
No, but people are using it.
That point has a meaningless handle.
Yeah.
What's the label of the track that represents the remote media?
I assume that's not set either. Not that was ever set, because we were never sending that over the wire.
What if we stuck the thing that's in the MSID, the signal, and put it in the track label?
Like where the label could change, then you mean? Like where initially it would be unset and then it would have...
Yeah. That could be more confusing, because there's an ID on one side, the label on the other side. And it would have to change. So I don't know if that works. I kind of agree with what other people have said, that it isn't worth trying to solve the problem, and it'd be reasonable to look into removing it from the MSID attribute.
I agree that we shouldn't go down the third bullet point. It's kind of like we've got some sharp edges you can step on, or there's a pit you can fall in or something.
Yep.
And either we document that there's a pit and say don't walk over there, or we try and make the pit somewhat smaller, somewhat less easy to fall into, or we just get rid of the pit.
Well, how can we get rid of the pit? I guess is the problem. If you're really saying that as soon as you call add track, a received track is created and has to have an ID, that essentially means that none of the callee's track IDs can be seen by the caller. If I understand this properly.
I meant bullet 2 was the remove pit.
Okay.
There's no, the track ID isn't signal at all, so there's no pit. You get rid of the pit by deleting all the land around the pit.
Cameron, what do we do with this in the implementation? Like, what do we do right now?
Well, I mean, Chrome and BSDP, so we haven't run into this problem yet.
But I was thinking of if we wanted to save track ID, I mean, we still consider a new track until you actually get something on the remote track. It's muted, so it's kind of doesn't really have any source. Could we say that as long as it's muted and does not have anything that's backing it up, it could be the track ID could be this nonsense, and you won't actually get a track ID providing information from the other side until it's been unmuted for the first time.
Well, regardless of how you do that, the track ID would change then, which is confusing and not to spec in media capture.
Yeah.
And you could still have, in some edge case, early media cases, having the media and going unmuted before the track ID actually arrives.
Yeah.
So I kind of feel like we have like this thing that's like taking on water, and like, you know, we try to like put tape on it, but ultimately there's just going to be more and more problems.
Yeah, especially when it's not actually used.
I think Justin's proposal here, how to move forward, is good. Like, let's do that and see what it looks like.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So just so we're clear, though, if we're talking about removing the ID from the MSID signaling, there's one edge case today where it still works. The track ID is synchronized, and that's if you call set remote description. The answer calls set remote description. In that case, set remote description creates the remote the receiver on that side. And in that case, the track IDs are correct. And there's people tried to pull out a web platform test that actually tests that. So are we saying that we're no longer required to preserve the track ID in that case, in that corner case, special case?
But if we remove the signaling, that won't happen.
Right. I mean, we're basically saying if you're looking at track that ID on the callee side to identify where the track is, that's going to stop working. So it might be more engaging implementers to see like, how big of an issue this will be. Find out how many people are actually using this.
So I just thought of another option D. Might be terrible, but because the receiver had two, one is like the early track and one is the late track. The early track has the random no ID, or the track ID, and the late track has the...
So we're down to 1 minute, so I don't think we can design it here anymore.
Yeah.
It sounds like TR should go investigate, you know, what the outcomes would be of removing it, and we can then report back. Is there anything else for today that we need to talk about?
No, I was going to say that we are out of time now, so we need to end. And the main outcome today is that Bernard, Cullen, Ecker, and Taylor are going to review WebRTC PC and for compliance on the technical requirements and report back before end of May. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone. and I'll try to compile some minutes till tomorrow.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Hey guys.